Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of World Building Guide. This episode is about NPCs and villains. I spent quite a bit of time thinking about what I wanted the next video to be, and looking back on the previous video of kingdoms and factions, I thought, well, what is a kingdom or a faction comprised of mostly? And it is of people. So I thought it'd be good to deep dive into this and discuss how to go about when it comes to making an NPC, and even further, maybe how to possibly design your villains or even your big bad. So, let's get into this. When you are creating an NPC, you need to think about what the purpose the NPC has. If it's going to be a one and done NPC, then don't worry about putting too much thought into it. But if you're thinking this is going to be a reoccurring character or an NPC of importance to the story, then you need to put a bit more thought into this NPC, because you'll find that sometimes the players will ask questions, or you might run into roadblocks with roleplay if you haven't thought through maybe how the NPC thinks or feels about certain things. Another thing is, I personally think if you want an NPC to be important, it needs to be memorable. You need to think about how you can make it interesting, either via, its personality, maybe it's a very specific race and class combo that is unique to your world. Think of something that NPC might provide that a regular NPC won't. Maybe this NPC has important information that only it knows. Or maybe it has some magical ability that's useful for the players. Give them a reason to remember that NPC when they're not around. I think the most important thing when designing an NPC that you want to be liked by the players, and when I refer to liked, I don't necessarily mean that the players, their characters might not necessarily like the NPC, but there might be something likable about that NPC that makes the players keep going back to them. The best thing you can do is think of a backstory for the NPC. It can make it feel more fleshed out. It can help direct how you think the NPC would act and feel. And also, if the players do show an interest in the NPC and they learn more about this character's backstory, it can provide a lot more of another dimension to them. If you want to go the extra mile, then consider what your NPC might be doing while the players aren't there. You've got to bear in mind that these aren't video game characters. They're not just stood idle doing nothing while the players aren't around. Maybe there are things that go on that the players really find out the next they meet them. For instance, you might have a recurring shopkeeper NPC that the party visit for supplies, and one time they visit and they notice the shopkeeper has a bruise on his face. When they inquire about what had happened, the shopkeeper tells them that a thug came in, attempted to steal from their store, and they had a fight. This can make the NPC feel more real, and that they have their own lives and struggles. You can even make the players be so invested that they're offered to help this NPC, therefore giving you your own sort of quest lines that the players are kind of showing interest in, and you can work off that. For me personally, I find that my players tend to show interest in NPCs that have these redemption stories. These characters the players feel like they can fix. I don't know what it is, but for some reason that seems to be the thing my players like. So from now and then I will try and design an intriguing and in-depth character that if my players show interest in, they can find something that can feel like a reward. But like I said before, at the end of the day, if not all NPCs have to be fleshed out like this. Some NPCs will be just throwaway characters. It's perfectly fine to make a Boblin the Goblin. This level of in-depth thinking and planning is more for those important, crucial characters that drive the narrative or provide a memorable and fun interaction for your players, giving that extra level of roleplay into your game. Now, pivoting from just designing any NPC to designing a villain, we have to consider a few more aspects about them. Now, when I'm talking about a villain, it could be your one-shot big bad, it could be your campaign's overarching enemy, or it could just be a side quest that took a couple sessions and they would get forgotten after a few levels. The amount of work you want to put into each villain will depend on what it is you want from the villain. I think there's a lot of things to consider when designing a villain, and we're trying to delve into them as best as possible. The first thing I want to talk about is I think it's a common trope for people to want to design a villain that has a twist. whether it be the friendly NPC the players have been hanging out with was the bad guy all along. Now, I think that's fine. I think it can provide a good surprise for the players. But there are other ways you could make these villains seem memorable and impactful to your players' experience. Why not instead have the villain appear and kill that friendly NPC? That can then leave an impact in a similar level. It means the players will not only maybe seek out revenge for their friend that died, but it also means that the villain is proven that he is a threat. I personally like to involve villains in my players' backstory, if it makes sense. That way, it can make the players have more of a personal investment with the villain, and they can play off that rivalry. My best suggestion is if you are doing a long form campaign with a overarching big bad, try to introduce your villain early. You might introduce it in person. Maybe the players get beaten by the villain and he decides to leave them alive as a gesture of goodwill or just arrogance. But maybe they don't meet him in person. Maybe he's introduced through rumours and stories, or perhaps you encounter some of his lackeys. Introducing the villain early not only makes it so the players build a familiarity with their big bad, it can also kind of set the stakes for things to come. An example I can give is perhaps a group of cultists worship the villain but under a different name. Later on, the players discover that this cult is actually worshipping the big bad without realising. It's an easy way to tie in the different threads if they don't seem necessarily connected straight away. Another example is maybe there is an old tale of the villain being defeated but promising to return someday to bring the end of days, foreshadowing things for the future. Maybe this means that your players rise up to be the heroes to stop this returning evil. Another factor of your villain is you want to figure out how much you want your players to know about him. It's fine to want to keep your villain secretive, not wanting your players to know everything about them straight away and slowly reveal it throughout the campaign. But if your players actively seek out information on the villain, try to reward that. That is them seeking interest and taking your bad guys seriously. Don't try and just cut them off, because it will make them feel that as if there's no help. For me personally, I feel if the players act on the knowledge they have learnt from the villain and become more prepared for the encounter, even if it makes the big bad not as strong, I think it makes it a reward to the players that they put the time and effort in to even the playing field. For instance, my big bad is a vampire. My players take the time to research the weaknesses of a vampire, acquire all the things they might need, such as holy water, wooden stakes, and so forth. They will probably have an easier time fighting the vampire, which I think should be the reward for doing that. They could have gone in without doing that, and they would have a harder time for it. You can also do the reverse of this. Perhaps the villain was almost defeated by the players and escaped and had a close call. The villain will now take the players more seriously and will maybe put more of their strategy and contingency plans on how better to defeat the players next time. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about will vary very much from villain to villain. If your big bad is a just ferocious dragon, then maybe you won't be putting as much of this sort of planning in place, and you might not want your players to necessarily be stocked up on dragon slayer arrows, so you kind of don't want them to be too prepared. Just have a consideration of what you want your players to have access to. Make sure that you keep things relatively balanced, and at the end of the day, if they defeat the villain as a cakewalk, celebrate their success. Personally, I like to run smart villains that are planning and use their cunning and guile to overcome the party. The best type of villain to me is a villain that is maybe arrogant, but it is well placed. Maybe they cast sending spells to the party, taunting them, or maybe they take a player character's family hostage. That is just the type of villain I like to run. If you want to do a maybe world-ending threat of a elemental titan, there's this force of nature that's going to destroy the world, that is just as much of a compelling villain. But even with that being said, just because your villain might not necessarily be this smart and charismatic character, doesn't mean you can't still have underlings that are those type of people. Maybe this elemental titan, for instance, has a cult that worship it, and the leader of the cult is a cunning and charismatic person. You can mix and match all of these thought processes and considerations for whatever sort of villain fits your campaign and your adventures. I hope this advice has been helpful for you guys, and I'd like to know what sort of villains and NPCs you can come up with in the comments below. Also, mention in the comments below what sort of videos you would like in the future. Still sort of thinking of some more things I can introduce to the world building guide. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.